The defense contractor in the American Midwest opens an email before sunrise and stares at an empty parts inventory screen. The radar assemblies are ready. The technicians are already on the floor. The payroll deposits cleared overnight. But one shipment of industrial magnets has not arrived, and an entire production line is now standing still. By 7:15, the procurement manager already knows the worst part of his day will not be the delay itself. It will be explaining why a production line worth millions is waiting on a part nobody in the room used to think about. The meeting itself feels absurd. Engineers capable of building advanced weapon systems are now waiting on a shipment most executives could not have explained 6 months earlier. The factory still exists. The contracts still exist. The fighter jet program still exists. That is what makes it dangerous. The shutdown did not begin with steel shortages or missing engines. It began with industrial magnets most consumers have never heard of. The high-performance magnets used in missile guidance systems, electric motors, drones, robotics, wind turbines, and advanced manufacturing equipment now move through a refining system China spent decades consolidating, while much of the West treated the process as dirty, low-margin industrial work. And unlike most shortages, these systems do not gradually weaken without the magnets. They stop. People look at Western technology and see invincible superiority. They see stealth aircraft, electric vehicles, satellites, smartphones, precision-guided systems, wind turbines, advanced robotics. The public assumption feels reasonable. The nations that design the world's most sophisticated products must control the industrial foundation underneath them. But a strange contradiction has emerged inside modern manufacturing. The smartphone in a consumer's hand may be designed in California, assembled overseas, financed through a Western banking system, and marketed as proof of technological dominance. But buried inside it are refined materials processed through facilities most consumers have never heard of and could not identify on a map. Ownership matters less once another country controls the layer that converts raw material into industrial permission. A man standing in an electronics store notices the replacement price for a phone has jumped again. He folds the old receipt and places it back in his wallet instead of upgrading. The shelves are still stocked. The lights are still on. The system appears functional. But underneath the visible economy, something has tightened. For years, the public was told the strategic race was about oil fields, semiconductor fabs, lithium mines, shipping lanes, or military hardware. The visible story focused on extraction. Whoever owned the mine was assumed to control the future. A mineral in the ground is not the same thing as industrial control. A map of global rare earth deposits creates the illusion of diversity. Australia has reserves. America has reserves. Africa has reserves. From high above, the industrial world looks protected, but then the roots begin collapsing inward. Ore pulled from different continents starts moving through the same refining corridors, the same export system, the same chemical bottlenecks. Like rivers feeding the same dam, the mine may sit in Australia. The dependency does not. These facilities are expensive, chemically hazardous, politically unpopular, and slow enough that a crisis can arrive years before the replacement capacity does. Inside another factory, a procurement manager refreshes the shipment dashboard again. Pending export approval. Not rejected, that would at least be clear, just waiting. Because once delivery schedules stop meaning anything, modern factories stop being production systems. They become waiting systems. The visible work continues. But fewer people inside the building still trust the schedules holding the system together. Meetings continue. The machinery still runs. The approvals simply stop arriving with enough consistency to plan around. Supervisors continue holding scheduling meetings for shipments nobody is confident will arrive on time. Households usually discover industrial dependence long before governments admit it exists. Not through a policy paper, but through a price tag, a delay notice, or a product that suddenly feels harder to replace. Dependency crises usually enter public life quietly first, as inconvenience, delay, and rising replacement costs. By the time ordinary convenience starts becoming unreliable, the underlying fragility is often already deeply embedded. Modern economies often fail this way first, not through disappearance, but through hesitation. Inside the factory, the conveyor belts are still running hours after production has effectively stopped. The slowdown still feels temporary to the people inside the building. The machine still exists. The worker still reports for the shift, but fewer people inside the building still trust the timeline holding the system together. But the invisible layer underneath the visible system begins deciding what can move and what cannot. And once a civilization outsources the layer that turns raw material into functional power, the question changes completely. The issue is no longer who owns the resources. The issue is who grants access to the finished form. The public story says the world depends on rare earth mining. The real dependency sits several layers deeper. A truck can pull raw ore out of the ground in the United States, Australia, or Africa. From the outside, new mining announcements create the impression that industrial independence is returning. The refining bottleneck remains underneath them, but ore is not a fighter jet component. Ore is not a precision magnet. Ore is not an electric motor. Between the rock in the ground and the finished product sits a refining system so chemically complex, environmentally difficult, and capital-intensive that much of the industrial world chose to outsource it decades ago. That decision looked rational at the time. The refining stage is expensive, chemically dangerous, politically unpopular, and slow enough that rebuilding capacity can take years longer than the crisis itself. And slowly, the invisible layer moved with it. A purchasing manager can still fill a spreadsheet with suppliers from multiple continents. That is the dangerous part. The dependency still looks diversified right up until the approvals stop moving. A factory manager stops promising delivery dates to customers because he no longer trusts the delivery dates suppliers are giving him. He does not call it a geopolitical problem. He calls it surviving the month. But when the material reaches the refining stage, the routes narrow. The spreadsheet still shows diversification. The shipping routes collapse inward anyway. Inside procurement calls, exact delivery dates slowly disappear first. Then confidence disappears from the language surrounding them. The same processing hubs begin appearing across procurement documents. Procurement teams begin circling the same company names across contracts that once looked geographically independent. The same approvals begin appearing behind supply chains that once looked separate. What looked like a competitive market starts behaving like a permission system. Procurement teams stop discussing prices first. Then they stop discussing timelines. Eventually, they start discussing access itself. The emails keep arriving. The approvals do not. Inside the defense plant, workers continue arriving before dawn because payroll still depends on production schedules written weeks earlier. But the confidence underneath those schedules starts disappearing first. Managers delay smaller decisions before larger ones. Overtime approvals quietly stop getting signed. Delivery promises become less precise. Procurement teams stop giving exact arrival dates altogether. By the end of the week, phrases like pending clearance begin replacing timestamps across the system. The factory is still operating, but fewer people inside it still trust the timeline holding it together. The system still looks operational from the outside. That is how industrial dependency usually hides itself. Most people imagine national power in terms of visible objects, aircraft carriers, semiconductors, energy reserves, satellites. But industrial leverage often sits inside the less glamorous layer. Nobody photographs. The chemical processing facility, the export license office, the specialized separator plant that converts unusable material into functional industrial inputs. The public sees products. The real power sits inside conversion, and once one country becomes dominant in that conversion layer, timing itself begins to change. A delayed approval in one processing corridor can idle factories thousands of miles away that never missed a payment, never lost a contract, and never expected access itself to become uncertain. The first denial rarely arrives as a dramatic announcement. It arrives as delay, a shipment held for review, a customs form awaiting approval, a factory schedule nobody fully trusts anymore. The real danger is not that the shipment never arrives. It is that nobody knows which shipment will be delayed next. The hidden mechanism is not ownership of the mineral. It is control over the stage that turns the mineral into industrial permission. The first disruption does not look historic when it arrives. It looks administrative. An export license enters review. A shipment receives additional compliance checks. Procurement teams are told delivery estimates are being reassessed. Inside corporate dashboards, expected arrival dates quietly slide backward by another week. No alarms sound inside the factories yet. The schedules still exist. The meetings still happen. But fewer people inside the system still believe the interruption is temporary. But timing has already started to break. A defense subcontractor waiting on specialized magnets delays one radar shipment. That delay pushes back another supplier dependent on the same assembly line. The second company postpones overtime. The third pauses hiring approvals. Within weeks, production schedules across multiple facilities begin reorganizing themselves around uncertainty instead of output. The failure does not need to be total. It only needs to arrive before payroll. Inside one manufacturing office, a procurement officer refreshes the same shipping portal throughout the afternoon, while vendors stop giving exact delivery dates altogether. Pending clearance becomes the answer to questions that used to receive timestamps and tracking numbers. The public still sees finished products sitting on store shelves. Investors still see functioning companies reporting quarterly earnings. Governments still describe the situation as manageable, but industrial systems depend on sequencing more than headlines. A single missing component can idle machinery worth millions. A delayed magnet shipment can halt electric motor production that supports aerospace systems, medical devices, consumer electronics, and defense manufacturing simultaneously. The visible economy continues operating right up until the moment synchronization fails, and households feel that failure long before they understand the mechanism behind it. A defense worker expecting overtime hours notices the next paycheck shrinking. A small supplier delays replacing aging equipment because future contracts suddenly feel uncertain. A consumer walks into an electronics store planning to upgrade a device, then quietly leaves after seeing rising prices and fewer available models behind the glass. The slowdown still looks temporary from the outside. For a few days, managers convince themselves the backlog will clear normally. Then another shipment slips into review. That is what allows the chain to spread. Large institutions usually survive delays longer than households can. Governments can absorb waiting periods. Major contractors can renegotiate schedules. Multinational firms can move inventory between regions and draw from reserves accumulated years earlier, but smaller firms live closer to timing pressure. A missed shipment becomes a delayed invoice. A delayed invoice becomes postponed payroll. Postponed payroll becomes debt carried at higher cost. And eventually the system begins converting industrial friction into household pressure. Officially, the factories remain open. Functionally, parts of the industrial base have already started going dark. Spain once possessed what looked like unlimited wealth. Silver fleets crossed the Atlantic loaded with metal extracted from the Americas. The Spanish crown controlled enormous mineral inflows that reshaped Europe's monetary system for generations. From the outside, it appeared to be the dominant economic power of its age. The empire had territory, military reach, resource access, and rivers of precious metal flowing into its ports. But beneath the appearance of abundance, another mechanism was quietly forming. Spain controlled extraction. It did not fully control the industrial system surrounding extraction. Spain possessed the silver, but much of the industrial leverage sat elsewhere. The treasure fleets arrived full. The dependency remained underneath them. The metal existed. Control over conversion did not. The modern version looks different, but the dependency pattern is almost identical. Today, the strategic material is not silver crossing the Atlantic in wooden fleets. It is refined industrial input moving through modern shipping corridors, export systems, processing facilities, and manufacturing chains that support the technological infrastructure of entire economies. And unlike Spain, one modern power studied the vulnerability carefully. Instead of merely extracting raw material, it spent decades consolidating the refining layer itself. Mines were acquired abroad while processing capacity concentrated domestically. Environmental costs were tolerated internally while many competing economies pushed hazardous industrial activity offshore. Universities trained specialists. Chemical infrastructure expanded. Export systems matured. Over time, the less glamorous industrial layer became the strategic center of gravity. From the outside, global trade still looked diversified. Inside procurement offices, dependence quietly narrowed. A Western executive reviewing supplier contracts could still point to multiple mining jurisdictions spread across continents. But procurement teams increasingly recognize the same processing companies appearing behind supposedly independent supply chains. The map looked global. The bottleneck did not. And the household consequences remained mostly invisible while the system functioned normally. Consumers saw affordable electronics. Investors saw rising technology valuations. Governments saw efficient global trade reducing costs and political friction. Very few people examine the refining stage because modern economies rarely reward redundancy during periods of stability. Dependency inside modern systems rarely feels dangerous during stable years. It feels efficient. Inside a modern defense plant, supervisors quietly start rewriting production assumptions they no longer fully trust. The machines are still there. The confidence underneath the schedule is not. History rarely announces dependency when it begins. It reveals dependency when access changes. Spain discovered that controlling inflows of raw wealth was not the same thing as controlling the industrial foundation underneath power itself. The modern version is even more difficult to recognize, because digital economies create the illusion that design and branding matter more than processing infrastructure. But eventually, every industrial system reaches the same question. Who controls the stage between resource and function? And history shows that when the answer becomes too concentrated, the pressure never spreads evenly. The people who design the system usually feel the pressure last. The people living closest to payroll feel it first. Inside a defense manufacturing plant, a technician notices overtime shifts disappearing from the schedule board 1 week at a time. The factory is still open. The parking lot is still full before sunrise. The fluorescent lights still buzz above assembly stations lined with partially completed systems. But the pace changes first, then the hours, then the confidence. A supervisor folds a revised production schedule and places it beside a cold cup of coffee because another shipment has moved from expected arrival to pending clearance. Nobody on the floor caused the delay. Most workers could not even identify the refining facilities creating the bottleneck. But the pressure reaches them anyway because modern industrial systems transfer uncertainty downward faster than they transfer accountability upward. The system did not need them to be reckless. It only needed them to be one supply cycle late. Smaller suppliers absorb the pressure even earlier. A family-owned machine shop producing specialized components for larger contractors rereads an email delaying procurement orders for the second time that month. The owner leaves the message open on the office monitor while calculating whether payroll should be delayed by 3 days or whether another credit line needs to be extended at a higher borrowing cost. The machines still work. The contracts technically still exist, but uncertainty has already started replacing usable planning, and households feel the strain in quieter ways long before the broader economy admits anything is changing. A defense worker who expected weekend overtime walks through an electronics store after work and notices fewer models available behind locked display cases. A parent postpones replacing a failing laptop because prices have drifted upward again. A small business delays upgrading equipment because delivery estimates no longer sound reliable enough to justify the expense. Nobody experiences the mechanism directly. They experience shrinking room. That is the humiliating part of dependency systems. Responsible people continue doing everything correctly while the room around them keeps shrinking anyway. Workers still arrive on time. Suppliers still honor contracts. Families still budget carefully at kitchen tables under the glow of overdue utility notices and automatic payment reminders. But timing begins controlling outcomes more than discipline does. Large institutions can often survive extended uncertainty because they possess reserves, leverage, political access, or negotiating power unavailable to ordinary firms and households. Smaller operators live closer to the edge of synchronization. They rely on shipments arriving when expected, invoices clearing on time, and schedules remaining stable enough to plan around. Once those assumptions weaken, pressure starts cascading unevenly, and somewhere else inside the same system, another group is gaining something extremely valuable from the disruption: more control over access itself. The same disruption that removes optionality from workers and suppliers increases optionality somewhere else in the chain. That is why dependency systems persist even when they become visibly fragile. Inside a major refining hub, production schedules continue moving because global manufacturers still need processed material regardless of political tension or industrial anxiety elsewhere. The leverage does not come from shutting the world down completely. It comes from controlling timing, approvals, prioritization, and access inside a system that no longer has enough alternative pathways. A delayed shipment in one country becomes negotiating leverage in another. The household experiences uncertainty as pressure. The institution controlling the bottleneck experiences uncertainty as influence. Inside procurement offices across Europe and North America, teams begin redesigning contracts around supply access rather than simple price efficiency. Long-term agreements become more valuable. Preferred buyers receive faster approvals. Politically aligned trade partners quietly move closer to the front of production queues, while everyone else waits longer inside administrative review systems that remain officially operational. The mechanism rarely presents itself as punishment. It presents itself as procedure. A multinational manufacturer with strategic importance may still secure partial deliveries because its scale gives it bargaining power smaller firms do not possess. A defense contractor may continue receiving limited shipments while lower priority industries absorb longer delays. Large firms can stockpile. Governments can negotiate state-level agreements. Institutional players gain time. Smaller companies purchase uncertainty at retail prices. Inside one machine shop supplying industrial components, the owner studies a revised borrowing agreement after delayed contracts begin disrupting cash flow. The bank still extends credit. The terms simply worsen. Higher rates replace older assumptions about stability. Financial pressure starts converting industrial fragility into ownership transfer, pricing power, and consolidation opportunities for firms large enough to survive extended disruption. The family sees a delayed invoice. The larger institution sees distressed positioning, and governments themselves gain incentives to preserve the structure once dependency becomes embedded deeply enough. Rebuilding refining systems domestically requires political tolerance for environmental costs, long construction timelines, chemical processing risks, regulatory battles, and years of industrial coordination that produce little immediate electoral reward. Maintaining dependence often feels easier in the short term and rebuilding resilience slowly and expensively. So the public continues seeing finished products, functioning stores, and active factories, while the deeper leverage quietly shifts underneath them. The smartphone still sits behind the glass display case. The factory still reports output. The earnings report still looks healthy. The pressure appears underneath timing long before it appears in headlines, but the timing behind the system belongs increasingly to whoever controls the refining layer, and that creates another dangerous illusion. What looks stable to the public may actually be functioning only because the bottleneck continues allowing it to function. What looks safest inside a dependent system is often the layer people stop examining. For years, Western economies believed diversification existed because products arrived from multiple countries, brands competed across global markets, and store shelves remained full. Consumers saw abundance, investors saw efficiency, governments saw low costs and uninterrupted access to advanced technology. The visible system appeared resilient. The dependencies sat underneath it. A defense manufacturer may operate inside a domestic facility with domestic workers assembling highly sophisticated systems under national security contracts. From the outside, the factory looks self-sufficient, but the timing inside the plant still depends on refined inputs moving through external processing systems that can slow, prioritize, or restrict access without shutting the visible factory down entirely. That is the dangerous part of modern fragility. The system can remain officially operational while becoming functionally constrained. Inside the same factory, the visible work continues. But the planning horizon has collapsed. Managers are no longer asking how fast they can produce. They are asking which promises they can still safely make. And rebuilding those pathways is not like reopening an abandoned warehouse. A new refining facility requires years of permitting, infrastructure construction, chemical processing expertise, environmental negotiation, specialized labor, and political tolerance for industrial activity. Many advanced economies spent decades removing from domestic life. Public announcements can happen quickly. Functional replacement capacity cannot. So the appearance of stability survives longer than the underlying resilience does. Consumers standing inside an electronics store still sees products locked behind glass display cases, but fewer models are available. Replacement prices drift upward. Delivery timelines stretch further into the calendar. The transaction still works, until convenience itself begins carrying pressure. That is the distinction modern systems struggle to recognize. The existence of a thing is not the same as control over its function. And historically, societies usually discover the difference too late, only after the visible structure remains standing while the access underneath it begins narrowing. So the real question is no longer whether the industrial world possesses technology. The real question is what actually survived when access to the hidden layer became uncertain. History shows that industrial systems rarely survive because they are the most efficient. They survive because they preserve redundancy before redundancy becomes fashionable again. During periods of disruption, the companies and states that endured longest were usually the ones controlling more than one stage of production at the same time. They mined material, refined it, stored it, manufactured with it, and maintained enough inventory to absorb delays that would cripple more optimized competitors. The system looked slower during normal years, more expensive, less elegant. But when access tightened, those inefficiencies became resilience. The old industrial logic was simple. Never allow a critical process to exist only one shipment away from interruption. Modern economies spent decades moving in the opposite direction. Inventory became a cost to eliminate. Redundant supply chains became inefficient. Chemical processing moved offshore. Warehouses shrank. Manufacturing systems optimized themselves around timing precision so tightly that even small delays now spread pressure through entire industrial sectors. And for a while, the strategy appeared brilliant. Consumers received cheaper products. Investors rewarded efficiency. Governments enjoyed lower visible costs. The hidden trade-off remained mostly invisible because the system continued functioning under stable conditions. But historically, the systems that survived stress were rarely the systems optimized only for stability. Inside a strategic materials warehouse, rows of stored industrial inputs sit untouched for years at a time. The storage costs are real, the maintenance costs are real, the political criticism is real because redundancy always appears wasteful right before it becomes necessary. Yet during periods of disruption, those reserves buy something markets struggle to create quickly: time. A refining system delayed by years cannot be replaced in a quarter. A disrupted supply chain cannot instantly manufacture skilled labor, chemical infrastructure, regulatory approvals, and industrial coordination simultaneously. Redundancy does not solve dependency completely. It simply prevents timing pressure from immediately becoming institutional paralysis. And even the systems that survived carried limitations. Stockpiles eventually deplete. Domestic refining remains expensive and politically difficult. Diversified supply routes still depend on transportation networks, energy systems, financing structures, and stable diplomatic relationships. Industrial resilience reduces vulnerability. It does not eliminate it. That is the uncomfortable lesson history keeps repeating. The strongest systems were not always the richest systems or the most technologically advanced systems. They were often the systems with enough slack, enough stored capacity, and enough tolerance for short-term inefficiency to continue functioning after synchronization failed elsewhere. Inside the defense plant, procurement teams stop discussing acceleration plans. They start discussing which production promises can still safely survive another delay cycle. What survived historically was not perfection, it was usable redundancy. And once that pattern becomes visible, a different question begins emerging from the modern economy itself. How much of today's apparent stability depends on systems that only function if timing never breaks? By the time a dependency becomes visible, most households no longer have the luxury of asking whether the system is fair. They start asking where the actual pressure sits. Not the headline, not the quarterly report, not the political language surrounding industrial policy. The pressure. A factory can still be operating while its procurement schedules quietly stop functioning normally. A technology company can still report strong earnings while replacement timelines stretch underneath the balance sheet. A government can still describe supply chains as resilient while critical production depends on approvals issued somewhere else entirely. That is why historical resilience was rarely about predicting collapse correctly. It was about understanding where access could narrow first. Inside the defense plant, managers continue refreshing shipment dashboards while partially assembled systems remain parked beneath fluorescent lights, waiting for components that technically still exist somewhere in the world. The material has not disappeared. The bottleneck sits between ownership and usable function. That distinction matters far beyond rare earths. Modern systems encourage people to measure security through visible numbers: market value, production volume, inventory counts, account balances, official reserves. But timing pressure usually reveals itself somewhere less visible: inside delivery reliability. Replacement assumptions, inventory depth, permitting delays, financing costs, or dependence on a single conversion layer. Nobody examined carefully during stable years. The useful question is often not, does the asset exist? The more important question is, under pressure, who controls access to the asset's function? A diversified portfolio can still depend heavily on industrial systems concentrated in one refining chain. A domestic manufacturer can still rely on external conversion infrastructure it does not fully control. A supply contract can still function only as long as transportation routes, export permissions, and political relationships remain stable enough to support it. And every layer carries limitations. Stockpiles buy time, not permanence. Domestic rebuilding efforts require years, political tolerance, and industrial patience that modern systems often struggle to sustain. Alternative suppliers reduce concentration risk but rarely eliminate dependence entirely because hidden processing layers still converge somewhere deeper in the chain. But history suggests the most fragile systems are usually the systems that leave themselves no room for interruption. Inside the electronics store, the customer holding an older phone studies rising replacement prices again before quietly putting the device back into a pocket that still contains last year's folded receipt. The product still exists. The store still operates. The economy still looks functional. But underneath the visible transaction sits a deeper question. Modern industrial societies are being forced to confront again. Is the system built for maximum efficiency, or is it built to keep functioning after access becomes uncertain? The world was told that technological supremacy belonged to whoever designed the most advanced products, but the forensic record points somewhere less visible. A fighter jet can still sit inside a secure hangar. A smartphone can still rest in a display case beneath bright retail lights. A factory can still operate beneath humming conveyor belts and fluorescent ceilings while workers continue reporting for shifts that no longer fully match material reality. The visible structure remains standing. What changes first is the layer underneath access. That is, the pattern history keeps repeating. Spain possessed silver without preserving the industrial foundation surrounding it. Modern economies built extraordinary technological systems while slowly allowing critical conversion layers to consolidate elsewhere. The products became more sophisticated, the dependency became harder to see, and because the system still functioned, most people assumed resilience still existed. But industrial civilization does not depend only on invention. Industrial civilizations rarely fail because they stop inventing. They fail when access to the invisible layers underneath invention begins narrowing. Inside the electronics store, the customer who postponed replacing a device still holds the old folded receipt in a jacket pocket. The product technically still exists. The store still appears full. The transaction still looks normal from a distance, but the margin underneath the transaction has narrowed. That is the larger truth modern systems struggle to admit. Ownership means less once another country controls whether ownership can function under pressure. Historical resilience rarely came from prediction. It came from enough slack, enough inventory, enough industrial depth, and enough tolerance for short-term inefficiency to keep functioning after synchronization failed. Because once timing starts controlling outcomes, efficiency alone stops behaving like security. If you want to understand how modern systems actually break beneath the surface of normal life, subscribe and keep watching. Because the century may not belong to the nation that mines the metal. It may belong to whoever controls whether the material can still become usable power once access turns uncertain.